Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Wilkes, and I'm the Director of Curatorial here at Tacoma Art Museum. We're excited that you are joining us for the lecture entitled The Image, the Object, and the Introduction with Michelle Dunn Marsh. Before we get started, it is important to acknowledge that we are located on the homelands of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. We acknowledge and honor the enduring Puyallup people and Coast Salish communities as we strive for a fuller understanding of the histories, currents of this place and a more equitable future. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Michelle Dunn Marsh. Michelle is the co-founder of Minor Matters, and her career has spanned 30 years working with and in support of American photographers on publications, exhibitions, and public programs. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Dunn Marsh.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. I am setting a stopwatch because I love talking about photography and could happily spend the entire rest of the afternoon, but some of you may want to move on to other things in an hour or so. So we'll try to pay attention to that. A couple of years ago, I was invited to be a judge at a state debate tournament at the University of Peterson, not so far away. And the young person who came in looked at me and said, "You're not one of our teachers." And I said, "No, that's correct, I'm not." He said, "You're not a debate coach." I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "What's your paradigm?" Now, I had jumped off of a plane and dashed down to Tacoma to help out a friend of mine, Katie Haynes, who is a debate coach for a school in Eastern Washington, and had invited me to judge at the tournament. So I was not entirely prepared for this question. I do know the meaning of that word, but I didn't understand the context, and so I paused for a moment, and he, with only the kind of arrogance an adolescent can handle, said, "What makes you qualified to be here?" And I paused for a moment and I said, "Well, I am a professional public speaker. People pay me to talk. Sometimes people pay to hear me." And he got very quiet very quickly and decided that I was perfectly qualified to judge cross-examination debate for the state of Washington. And I bring that up to say, I'm going to be sharing with you this week my paradigm. And for those of you who are maybe less familiar with that word, because it's not a word we use very often, it can refer to the factors by which you define your universe and how you view the world. And I'm sharing that one because I really did love that this young person wanted to know, if I was at the state tournament, why did I deserve to sit in judgment of them? And number two, the importance of us knowing what forms our perspectives. And for those of you who decide to attend next week or are choosing to attend next week, when we focus on reading photographs, we will spend more time talking about how we get better at understanding our paradigms and what frames what we see in the world. So a few of the things that form my paradigm today, that affect how I see the world today. Today is the 1st of February, which you probably know because you looked at a calendar and chose to be here today. It is also Saturday. This is Imbolc, which in the ancient Irish calendar is the first day of spring. So hold on to that hope. It is no more springy in Ireland right now than it is in Tacoma, Washington. But the way that they set the seasons is a little bit different than we think about it today. And it is with hope and anticipation that they define the beginning of spring. We should be pretty close right now to the beginning of Vasant Panchami, which is the Saraswati Puja in the northern parts of India. And that specific festival honors the goddess of learning and of arts. And it is often the day that children read for the first time. I learned this in 2017 when I was there, and so I offer those elements as some sense of a little bit more of what we'll talk about that form my perspective. Today, also in the United States, is the first of a month that we traditionally honor the contributions of African American and Black Americans. And so I am beginning this presentation, before even my title presentation and my thank yous, with the work of India Beale. And this first slide shows 3 portraits that she made of her mother 20 years ago. I got to know India, her work in 2014. I met her for the first time in 2016. And these photographs are included in a book that is in the Davis Gallery upstairs called All Power, Visual Legacies of the Black Panther Party. The work that I wanted to include, I will show you in a moment. India offered these photographs of her mother and said that she was comfortable with these photographs being included in a publication that was looking at the legacies of a social and political party that had formed in the 1960s. She was unwilling to include what is her best known body of work. This is Sabrina and Katrina from a series called Am I What You're Looking For? And there are about 26 photographs in this series. They were made between 2012 and 2018. And she invited young women to dress as they would for job interviews and then interviewed them about their sense of what it would be like to work in corporate America. We will talk a little bit more about this photograph and reading photographs next week, but I wanted to share this for a couple of reasons in terms of honoring Black History Month. India is an artist I continue to be incredibly inspired by. And one of the most difficult conversations we ever had was why I could not include this work in the Black Panthers book. And she said, Michelle, my goal, I love that my work is exhibited in galleries and will be shown in museums. My goal is to change corporate America. My goal is to create opportunities in Fortune 500 companies. And the Black Panthers, frankly, I'm not sure I want my work associated with that. And I paused on that. She's younger than I am, and I said, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about your associations with the Black Panthers and my associations with the Black Panthers. Having at that point done work over about 10 years with leaders in Oakland and here in Seattle. And I understood what she was afraid of. I understood that she was afraid that people would perceive her work negatively because they had assumptions and associations about a period of history. And she served on a panel 2 years later where this work was exhibited as part of All Power, Visual Legacies of the Black Panther Party. And she sat on a panel and publicly said to Aaron Dixon, who was one of the co-founders of the movement here in Seattle, I didn't know the totality of your history. And I let fear drive it. And so I shared that today because we all have important choices every day to be making about what we show and what we don't, and where, and our understandings of those associations, and how we choose to grow in our own knowledge. I always like to start with my teachers, and because I grew up here in Puyallup, this begins with my junior high yearbook teacher, who has a lot to do with why I'm standing before you today. This is the work of Paul Strand, who actually was my first relationship with the Tacoma Art Museum. I am embarrassed that I don't know when that was, but I was working for the Aperture Foundation And we were traveling an exhibition of Paul Strand's work, and it was hosted here at the Tacoma Art Museums probably 20-ish years ago, more than 20 years ago, early 2000s. I will share a little bit more about my relationship with Paul Strand. So thank you for indulging that point of introduction. I am very grateful that the Tacoma Art Museum has invited me to speak with you these next 2 weeks about the history of photography. I feel that it is important, as I've addressed, to speak about this from my personal history. My personal history is also a professional history, but when we think about history, we sometimes forget that all histories are inherently related to whoever's telling the story. And that's the beautiful thing about storytelling, that's been true for millennia. I just try to be a little more transparent about it, so that you understand that if I'm talking about this artist and not this artist, that some of that is coming from my professional perspective, my personal perspective, and what I am drawn to. I did something. No. Well, this is why I brought prints. We can just move to the back of the room. All right, so in the meantime, let me speak to you about why there are some photographs on the table and on the wall in the back space. Photography has changed dramatically really throughout the totality of its less than 200-year history. And the technology has continued to inform ways that people work with. In the last 30 years, we have certainly experienced this. We have been able to make pictures with this little device that we call a phone, but we use as a computer. We almost never use as a phone anymore. And there have been huge shifts and changes in the effect on image making with the technologies that we can access. And so because we have seen, we have seen more images created in the last 20 years than the entire 160 years preceding. And images are coming at us at a rapid pace. We are in some ways so kind of blinded to seeing images everywhere that we accept a lot of that information without even really stopping. And so when I speak about photography, my life in photography started before that. It started with photographs being physical objects. It started with photographers. I'm pointing at Adrian Chesser, who's sitting over here, because I have a very strong memory of him showing me a body of work he published 15 years later in a box in the trunk of the car. Because that's how we looked at work. That's how we looked at work. So I grew up on the land of the Puyallups, and I am so grateful to have had that experience. The image of Mount Rainier as a child and the acceptance that a 14,000-foot entity could appear and disappear was really an important part of my relationship to seeing. Also important to my relationship to seeing is that a mountain I could not see in 1980 made itself known. And I share this because every person in this room has a few formative moments that have impacted your seeing. We just rarely pause to think about them. We don't really have any reasons to think about them, unless for 20 years people ask you what informs your seeing, and then you start to come up with answers like these. But these mountains and these moments with each of them were really quite important. Mount Rainier being visible in the morning is the only time I ever skipped school. And my history professor was very understanding. We always brought him a donut, and left him a little note saying the sunrise was beautiful. Well, there's Dad in Lakewood. Is this the one you were talking about? You don't need to see me. But next to Dad, this is my plug for Carrie. Next to Dad, should you choose to purchase the book that some of these photographs come from, is a photograph of me, also taken in Tacoma, wearing my father's tux. My father grew up in Iowa, graduated from Clover Park High School. That photograph is the entrance to the VA hospital in Lakewood. And I had included these two black and white photographs, only one of which you get to see as a teaser, ha ha ha. Because, again, our relationships to photography are informed by a lot of things, and one of my relationships to photography is formed by the notion of authenticity in memory. Oh, Mom appears. Well, there you get to see Dad and me and Mom. My mother is from Burma, and she came to the United States in 1963. This is my first communion at All Saints Church in Puyallup. That's the only photograph that I have of me with both of my parents. And this is the last portrait of my family as a whole. This was taken 6 weeks before my father died. And again, thinking about relationship. This is not an extraordinary photograph for aesthetic reasons or composition, but it is the first photograph I would grab if my house is going to burn down, or if I need to leave. And so the content and the context of imagery is something that continues to evolve for us over time. I was introduced to photography as an art form as a student at Bard College. Not in class, but in an internship. I was doing the most important thing an intern can do, which was getting coffee and bagels. And I walked into the office, and the art director, the director of publications, and the designer and editor had a 45-minute conversation about the proposed design of this cover of the magazine. And that 45-minute conversation centered largely on whether you should see the title of the magazine first or the photograph. And I did not know what this world was called. I hadn't really heard the term graphic design. I didn't really understand what art directors did that were different than editors. But I knew that I wanted to be in the room where those conversations were. What I also learned is that though this is the alumni publication of Bard College, William Wegman, featured on the cover, and a portfolio of 8 pictures inside, had nothing to do with Bard College. Neither did Cindy Sherman, who was featured on the cover of the next issue with a portfolio of 8 images. Neither did Thomas Struth. The majority of the people that Ginger Shore, who was the director of publications, chose to feature in this magazine had nothing to do with the college. She featured them because she was the director and she could. And that was a very important lesson for me. She was married to Stephen Shore, and I'll talk about Stephen in a little bit. She understood great photography. She trained with Walker Evans and was a picture editor at Fortune magazine. And she deeply loved the art form of photography. She understood that it was not always seen as an art form. And so she simply used her agency wherever she could to highlight what she considered to be great. And though it took me probably 10 years to really figure out the importance of that, it was an element that stuck with me and is something that I continue to do today. I threw in a couple paintings just for fun. I was studying art history and English at Bard, and one of the great things about being at a school that was an hour and a half from New York City was your professors had no problem whatsoever simply saying, go to New York, find something to write about it. And so this was an art history course focused on the Renaissance, and this painting, this panel is at the Frick collection, private collection, still in a house So my understanding of what it meant to own objects of art and live with them and choose whether or not you shared them with people was really very much informed by this moment. But to sit in front of this painting, which I'd only ever seen in a semi-crappy slide, kind of like how I'm showing it to you here, to sit in front of this actual work and to know that it was made before Columbus found his way to not India was so profound. And the relationship between the person who made this, the materiality that had lasted, and now it's sitting here in front of me because someone thought it was important and took care of it and allowed it to continue to exist, was a very powerful moment that I never, oh no. Well, it's a good thing I brought these in. That I never lost. And so my relationship with the object of photography was very much formed by this moment. So I almost didn't bring in the postcards, and it's a good thing I did because that slide is not showing up. This experience at Bard, studying art history, working in the publications office, completely undid my life plan to be a poet and sit under trees, writing work that no one would ever read. I hope to return to that someday. Could be happening sooner than we think. In the meantime, I was thrust into a world that was causing me to think about things I never thought about before, that was creating an opportunity to learn of things and about ways of existing in the world and seeing that were unlike anything that I had ever experienced. So this was a slide. Maybe this won't show up. Nope, not here. Okay, Stephen Shore, who teaches photography at Bard, is one of the most important color photographers. Some people say the most important photographer working in the United States. I'm going to qualify color because we often get qualified as women, so why can't we qualify him for color? Stephen was married to Ginger. I never took a photography class with him. He mostly spoke about fly fishing and baseball in the social circumstances when I spent time with him. But I learned a lot. I have learned a lot from Stephen about seeing, and had the opportunity to travel with him. I never fully understood, and you will get an opportunity to look at the postcards in reality as opposed to the significance of when they are projected at whatever 8 feet this is. The difference in that relationship of how we perceive them. But Stephen had his first solo show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when he was 23 years old. And he was an only child, and both of his parents had died by the time he was 18. And so he, having grown up in New York City, been exposed to Andy Warhol, and spent time at the factory, he then hit the road and would do these cross-country trips. And the postcards that you will see are from a series called Tall in Texas. And he photographed the city of Amarillo, and he thought that it would be very ironic to make postcards of a city that nobody really cares about and present them as a work of art. However, he really wanted to do them as postcards, and so at the time, the minimum postcards you could print was 5,000. So he made the investment to print 5,000 of a set of 10. So that's a lot of postcards. And then, and I do encourage you to look at this on the actual pieces in the back. When he got the postcards back, he realized that they all had the same shade of blue in the sky. And he called the printer and he was like, my photographs don't look like this. And the printer said, I know, they're kind of terrible. You can't have postcards without blue skies. No one's gonna buy a postcard without blue skies. I did you the favor of adding blue skies. And I heard this story from Stephen many years later and said, do you still have a set of those postcards? He's like, I have a few. He then started putting them in other cities, like when he was doing his cross-country trips, he would just go into a random small town and stick them in the postcard racks. So there are pictures of Amarillo, Texas, all over the United States. Stephen, to me, was the wife of my boss. The husband of my boss. Until I took a course in the history of photography. And his photograph was one of the few color photographs included in the 1976 edition of Beaumont Newhall's The History of Photography. And I was so excited that I took it to him because I wasn't sure if he knew. I say this because it is easy at certain points in life to think that you always knew what you now know. Knowledge is something we build over time. And because of this medium, I continue to want to know. But 30 years ago, I definitely didn't know very much. Stephen took this photograph of me. It's sitting in the back. It's an RC print. For those of you who may know that those are not, those were done for reproduction. We didn't really think of them seriously as prints until 50 years later, people figured out that RC prints, if stored correctly, held up fine. In fact, we have a few RC prints in Charles Peterson's exhibition. Stephen took this picture of me and another picture of me, which is a group of friends of mine, which is also in the back. And I stuck it in a manila folder, and I tossed it in a file with my diploma, and I didn't really think too much. And then a decade or so went by, and I learned that Stephen Shore was more important than I thought Stephen Shore was, and was like, hey, I think you took this picture. And he said, yeah, I did. Do you want me to sign it? And I said, no. Why would you sign it? Then I have to take care of it. And he laughed. And this photograph is also in Seeing Being Seen, is in the book that I wrote about my life in photography. And I did a funny thing. I wanted to tell the story of where Bard changed my life. And so I wanted this photograph to be big in the book and to go across 2 pages. And I split it. I split it like right about here. And I sent the postcard layout to Stephen, and at the last minute, I sent him the layout for this as well. And said, are you okay with how the postcards look? And he said, yes, but I don't want you to split the other image. And I was like, why does he care about this picture? Like, to me, it wasn't a Stephen Shore picture. Right? It was the day I graduated from college. But the minute that I put this photograph in its entirety on a single page, I saw a structure in this roof and the element of sky and the mortarboard that I had not seen, though I had been looking at this photograph for 10 years. Changing context. I had to see it not as my graduation, but as a work of art by Stephen Shore, and different elements. From Bard, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Silly, silly me. I skipped my senior year, went into graduate school in a program in publishing in New York City, and learned for the first time, and this is related to the history of photography, even though it's a pain, I learned for the first time that galleries sell things. They are not the same as museums. Nobody teaches you that. Nobody says that out loud, ever. But the fact of the matter is, with the exception of the store, you can't buy anything in here just because you like it. It belongs to the Tacoma Art Museum. It will live here forever because it belongs to the Tacoma Art Museum, and it is made available for us to see. I went to a gallery and I saw these paintings by Piet Mondrian that I had studied in art history, and they were amazing. And then I heard people talking about how much money they were going to spend on it, or not going to spend on it. And I realized that once somebody owned that, I wouldn't get to see them. And that was also an important moment in understanding what it means to live with art. I also also, one of the first exhibitions that I saw in New York that really impacted me was the work of David Warner-Rovich. David died in 1990. And again, I was 2 hours away in the Hudson Valley of New York when he was in New York City. He was a very important artist, not particularly known for his photographs, though he used photography quite extensively in his practice, but he was also a painter and a writer and a filmmaker. And so there was an exhibition in 1999 at the New Museum that Aperture published a book of his work in 1994 that I had seen that included this photograph. I actually bought this photograph as a wedding present for a person I'm no longer married to. Perhaps this gesture was really not the best idea. Just saying, it is a beautiful photograph, and David's work, he found ways to speak, in some cases very directly, about what it meant to be dying of AIDS and to see his friends dying of AIDS and to know that there was not support on any level, social, governmental, in terms of healthcare. And then there were times where he did works like this that were so gentle and poetic. And Gary Schneider, who printed for him, pointed out to me, and you can barely see it, but if you look to the sort of upper right-hand side, there is a little bit of a reflection. So this is a photograph of a diorama in the Natural History Museum, and that's David's reflection. And I will talk a little bit next week about indexicality and the relationship between the photographer and the subject and time in the object. But to know that these many years later, we still have a little bit of David in that work is again something that within photography specifically also spoke to me very profoundly. I moved to New York City having never lived in any city other than Puyallup, Washington. So it was a little overwhelming. And at the same time, very exciting to see things that I had seen in photographs still exist in life. And so the subway station that I exited from was at the base of this Flatiron building. And to be able to see something that I had seen in this photograph by Steichen still exists, and that you could walk down the street on a winter's evening and get pretty close to this view, created that sense that with photography specifically, while there is always an interpretation in the creation of any artwork, photography is being drawn from life. And particularly at that moment in time, photography was being drawn from life. And so our ability to connect with it as humans, as people who are living in a moment, in a space and time, but to also be able to time travel a little bit, and being able to enter into these photographs was something that was incredibly powerful. So the next series of images that I'm going to share with you are photographs by the founders of Aperture magazine. I learned of the Aperture Foundation when I was a student at Bard because Aperture had published the work of Stephen Shore. Aperture had published the work of Larry Fink, which any of you who attended Charles Peterson's lecture a couple of weeks ago. Charles is a huge fan of Larry's, and I got to know, I met Larry when I was at Bard, but I got to know him better much later. And so the books were in the college bookstore. And that was my first experience with this organization. Aperture was founded in 1952 by a group of photographers and writers. And its mission at that moment in time was to celebrate photography as an art form and to communicate with creative people everywhere. It was published intermittently, as they described, starting in 1952. Minor White was designated as the editor for two reasons. Number one, he missed the meeting when they were determining who was going to be the editor. So as is true in all great meetings that you miss, you get assigned the most responsibility if you're the person who's not there. And number two, he was the poorest economically of any of the founders. And so if the whole thing went belly up, they were like, well, there's no one to sue, no one can come after him for money, he doesn't have it. And that is how Miner was designated as the editor. Aperture Foundation is now 73 years old, and it was, after Bard, probably one of the most important experiences of my life. This is a photograph that I will ask you to spend a little bit of time holding on the screen, because I did bring this print in, so you will have the opportunity to just think about holding this image and then seeing the object. Miner White is particularly important to me, largely because he was the teacher of my teacher. First and foremost, that was my relationship to who this person was as not only a photographer and a writer and an editor, but he was the teacher of my teacher, Steve Barron, who I studied with in graduate school, who hired me at Aperture, and who taught me how to print black and white photography. And so I own this print because when Steve retired from Aperture, he said, I know that you've always wanted a Miner White print. And I always teased him because he had two prints of the same photograph. One that was made very early, and one that was made closer to the end of Miner's life in the late 70s. And he said, okay, I'm going to sell you one of these. Which one do you want? And I said, I want the one that he gave you when you were his student. Because, again, that was the relationship that mattered to me. It was not so much really, honestly, that I was in love with this photograph, though I am now, and have become so. It was simply, I wanted an artifact of his relationship because Steve was so important to me and Miner was so important to me. So when I went, you're all going to start to understand why perhaps the buffalo falling husband didn't stick around. When I went to him and said, so I know we were saving money to buy a house. I have to take my saving part of that out because I have to buy this photograph. And thankfully, he was very understanding of that. He was like, great. I've been wanting to build another motorcycle. You take out your half, I'll take out my half. We'll both be happy. And then I showed him the print. And he was like, why is it that the more money you spend, the smaller the object gets? I don't have an answer for this. But this in particular is a print that, for me, changes how I see. And I have had the privilege of living with it for 22 years now. And along with the last photograph of my family of origin together, it is definitely the one that I grab. It is the one that I hide when I leave the country. It is the print that I cannot live without. This guy, a few people have heard of. He was also one of the founders of Aperture. He hired Miner White to teach at what was then the California Institute of Fine Arts, became the San Francisco Art Institute, unfortunately no longer exists as an institution. Ansel was involved early on in the existence of Aperture. He did not stay deeply involved, but he was involved in the formation of a number of nonprofits at this period of time because he had a greater public profile. And he understood the importance of being able to use the public profile that he had to support the Society for Photographic Education, to support Aperture, to support the Center for Fine Art Photography, which is still in existence in Carmel. This is probably his most famous photograph. I am not a huge fan of landscape photography, and again, that's why it's important to know people's paradigms. You won't see very many landscapes in this presentation, because I grew up in the shadow of Mount Rainier. I don't need to see that in a photograph. I'll wait for it to choose to appear when it wants to, and I will soak in that moment. This is also a slide that I will, again, suggest. This is actually a particularly important image that you have the opportunity to experience now 3 times. And I'm I'm looking at time and realizing I need to talk about it. This photograph is in Charles Peterson's Nirvana. There is a platinum print that is a posthumous print, meaning it was made after the death of the photographer. It is being shared here with you in slide form from the print that is in the back. Barbara Morgan was one of the founders of Aperture. She was particularly interested in the relationship between photography and dance, the documentation of performance. How do you hold a transient thing? And her photographs of Martha Graham, who's featured here, are some of the most important, both in the history of dance and in the history of photography. She and her husband founded a publishing company. They published books, she designed, she did a lot of different types of work, and her collages and photo montages, if you ever get a chance to see those, are really quite extraordinary and very different from her dance work. She was also a mother, and she raised 2 boys while she was keeping her career in art going. This is the first photograph I ever purchased. It is a photograph that has no monetary value, largely because of its condition. And that is why I felt comfortable buying it, because I knew I couldn't break it. It was already broken. And at the same time, over the years, its damage has made it more valuable to me. It allows me to see it as an object and to understand fragility. And I also love that no one else in the world will want to buy it, except that I keep talking about it. And so maybe someday someone will want it. The other founders of Aperture included Beaumont and Nancy Newhall. This is the textbook that I showed Stephen Shore, because I didn't think he was in it. Nancy and Beaumont were both writers and curators and photographers, but their participation in words and photographs arriving together and elevating the art form as a whole were very significant to what became kind of Aperture's mission. I also list the non-famous people because nobody ever talks about them, but there were 3 other people involved in the formation of Aperture: Melton Ferris, Ernest Louis, who was a designer, and Dodie Weston Thompson. Of the founders, the only person I ever met was Dodie Ward, and she was 88, and I met her in 2005 in Los Angeles. The last one I'm going to share here, this is Dorothy Lang, along with Ansel Adams, were probably the best known of the people who originally founded Aperture. This is, of course, a photograph that many people are very familiar with. This is a gravure that Aperture produced along with the first major publication of examining her life and history called Photographs of a Lifetime. So the print was made in 1982. From this world that I entered into at 22 years old, all those people were dead, but they were known to all of the people that I was working with. They were living beings to the people I work with. And I bring that up because, again, when we think about history, it's very easy for it to disappear quickly. But when I looked at people in a textbook, they were not abstract, they were humans. They were humans who had interactions with people that I was with. And so the next evolution of that was unawareness of, and I'm sharing this one because this is the first photographer I met who literally went from being a typeface on a cover of a book into a whole manifested, loud human being. It was kind of terrifying. And at the same time, became an important reality for me to understand that I could talk to people. I could talk to photographers. I could learn from them, not only from the images, but from the individuals who had made those images. And so I'm just taking you through somewhat quickly of a sense of the contemporary photographers who were active and being published in the mid to late 90s when I entered into this we have a few not showing up, but that's okay. I was working at Aperture as a book designer, and that meant that I was handling, again, physical objects, physical prints. We usually saw them all once at the beginning of a project. We used the prints to lay out the book, so laying them out in a floor space like this. And then they got put away, and we didn't see them again until they were being sent to the printer. So if you've seen any pictures of how Charles Peterson was working on his initial edit of the Nirvana book, he was doing it the same way. There is a physical, tactile element to how we work with photographs, and having the opportunity to hold those prints, to touch those prints. The last photographer I showed, Jeff Dunas and Carrie Mayweaves, were two projects that I was working on in the late 90s. Carrie Mayweaves was the first artist I ever worked with whose work I knew before the project managers. And this is a very important series, the Kitchen Table series. Carrie is still an active artist. But to take a person, again, who was coming out of a page and understand that we had the opportunity to take her work and showcase it forward through a publication was a profound experience. This is the book that I had the honor of working with her on, called Hampton Project. So the top shelf here are publications that I have worked on over the last 3 years. From that experience at Aperture, I went on to work directly with photographers in public programming. And so the next series of images that I'm going to run you through are some of the significant American photographers that actually we were bringing out to the West Coast through a lecture series. I'll start with Mary Ellen. How many people are familiar with the work of Mary Ellen Mark? Mary Ellen spent a lot of time in Seattle. That's why I asked. It was one of her favorite cities, though she came from the Philadelphia area and lived in New York City. She loved Seattle. She started working here in the 1980s and continued to come back until she passed away in 2015. The card on the left, I don't even know where I got it, I think at the Seattle Art Museum when the Hallmark show of photography was exhibited there sometime. It would have been the year of graduation. I've never seen representation of anyone who looked like my mother in a museum. And I bought this card and brought it home because when we saw brown people in the grocery store, my mom would bring them home and make them tea because that's what Michelle looked like. There weren't very many. And so that inclination of just, okay, I have to make a connection to this. I had no idea that Mary Ellen took that photograph until 5 years after I'd been working with her. Remember how I said this is kind of a lifelong learning process? You just gotta keep learning. When I made that connection, I was like, how insane is that? And Charles and I have this conversation a lot. Sometimes you get to hang out with people and you don't fully realize what an amazing opportunity that is. And you're not really thinking about it in that moment. But to suddenly connect, like, wow, this image that I responded to so early on in my life, now I get to spend time with the person who made that image and many more. Mary Ellen's best known series is called Streetwise, and that's the work that was made in Seattle. But why show you that when I can show you this amazing photograph? Eugene Richards, also predominantly known as a documentary photographer. This is work I showed at Photographic Center Northwest in 2015. This is a series that he made when his then partner was dying of breast cancer. She was a writer, and this was in 1984, I think is when she was first diagnosed. And she asked him to photograph as much of the process of her treatment as possible to be able to share with other women what experiences she was having. But again, this photograph for me transcends all of those senses of context. So this is Jean's hand here, holding on to This is a terrible JPEG of Lorna Simpson's work, 5-Day Forecast. Lorna has gone on to, again, become one of the most significant American artists of our time. She spoke here in Seattle in 2004 as part of the After West Lecture Series. Sylvia Plahe is in the exhibition upstairs. She is the only photographer that I know of who had her own column in first a weekly magazine, The Village Voice, for about 20 years, and then she was given a column book in the New York Times and was the first photographer introduced in The New Yorker, who had only ever used illustration prior to that. Sylvia has a dark and delighted way of seeing the world. She and her family left Hungary after the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. She was 13. Was in Germany and then ended up in New Jersey. Graduated from high school there, studied graphic design at the Pratt Institute, and started working actually as a graphic designer at The Voice, but had already started making pictures and taking photographs. And she has a very specific way of seeing, not unlike Alice Wheeler. I can't even always quantify it. I will ask you to think of this image when you see Baseball Plie upstairs. And the portrait of Jean-Michel Basquiat is also by Sylvia. That's Sylvia. This is in here shamelessly for Charles. This was my reconnection with Larry Fink 10, 12 years after I was a student at Bard. He was photographing the party. Sylvia had taken me to it. I was running into great documentary photographer Charlie Harbit. And so we're in this party, there's all this stuff swirling around, and Sylvia suddenly holds up an empty wine glass to her face. Like, do you want more wine? I can just go get you more wine. She's like, no, I'm giving Larry a photograph. She could sense him. He was across the room. But she could sense that he was looking our direction, and that he was thinking about making a picture. And after she saw this, of course I had to write Larry afterwards and be like, Sylvia said this, I don't buy it. And he was like, he just sent this image as a response. And she said, gosh, I thought the glass would have distorted my face way more than it actually. Relationships. This is from also Larry from the series Social Graces. His brand new book, which was the last major project before he passed away in 2023, has just released. Millet, a very different work from the work that is also included upstairs. Recently had a solo show at the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Ami is also a refugee and came to the United States via Paris as a result of her family needing to leave Vietnam. And she is one of the most interesting photographers I know of in terms of how she has chosen to approach trauma and how she makes work about aspects around war. Her first book was called Small Wars. This photograph is published in that. It was published by Aperture in 2006. And if that is a subject matter that you are interested in, I will encourage you to spend more time looking at the work. I included this in this section because actually it was the same time, mid-2000s, that I got to know this body of work of photographs of water stores. It took 15 years to bring it forth into the world, which we eventually did. But it is still, I think, one of the most important series that I've seen on the commodification of nature. William Christoberry, also known as a large format color photographer, returned to Hale County, Alabama, where he was born and raised. He made his career in Washington, D.C. He taught at the Corcoran, but he continued every summer to return to Alabama, which is the site of the book by Walker Evans and James Agee, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Chris and Mary had grown up there. And so his photographs are often seen in series to show the effects of time on structures and the landscape. One of the early works from Painful as Thomas, 21 years ago, this is priceless. I'm very honored to have been a part of the publication of Hank's first publication, Pitch Blackness, and he was nominated for a book prize, and we were having conversations. He was making a lot of work about his cousin Sanga's murder, and had been making work for about 3 years at that point about the work. And I said, how do you describe this in a way that is more than your personal grief? Because I understand your grief, but how do we speak about this work so that other people can enter in? And the beginning of his application for the book prize that resulted in his first book was, my work is now looking at the effects of young Black men killing young Black men. And in that moment, he was able to move from something that was about the loss of an individual to speaking to an issue that was occurring in society. And when we think about work that moves forward in the world, that allows us the opportunity to say, as museums are often aiming to do, as publishers are often aiming to do, as photographers are often aiming to do, how does this matter through time? Sometimes it's the ability to see something a little bit differently. So when Charles Peterson said to me, would you ever consider us doing a book together? I said, respectfully, my famous friend, why? You had books. You don't need another book. And he said, I have music books. I would like a book that's about photography. 5 years later, not only do we have a book, we also have an exhibition. Look at that. Trevor Peglin, I added last night. Trevor Peglin has been examining matters of surveillance in the United States for the last 20 years. If that is a topic that is of interest to you, I strongly encourage you to spend some time with this book. He was based in California for many years, grew up in Northern California, he's in Berlin now, I think. I have to show some of the people who are directly connected to music photography. This man, Graham Nash, is a big one, and how great that these two are on a moment together on Thursday in Los Angeles. I got to know Graham through photography. He's been making photographs since he was 13, and he's going to be 83 this year, so a long time. Most people in the world certainly know him as the Hollies, or 1/3/1/4 with Crosby, Stills, Nash, or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But he's a very serious photographer and also a collector of photography. And I learned a lot from him. He curated a show at PMP, now Mopop, about his favorite music photographs. And the photographer who had the most number of photographs in that exhibition was this man, Jim Marshall. Charles was on a really great panel with Jim as part of that show in 2010. I love this picture. Even if you don't care who Johnny Cash is, there's photographs that we can continue to spend time with, and over time see different elements in him. This is the work of Eleanor Carucci, and there is an issue of Aperture magazine from 1999 on the table in the back that has a very simple photograph of a woman's fingers on a bar, kind of a crusty looking bar of soap. And that photograph impacted me in such a deep and profound way of realizing that anything is worthy of seeing if you see it. And that is the art form of photography. And so to have the opportunity to work with Eleanor on the second edition She is a woman artist who is speaking about aging in probably the most direct manner of any photographer that I know. This is a portrait by Sylvia Plahy. I have included here and in the back a couple of photographs of me, not because I just need to see more images of myself, but because in speaking about the art form of photography, and people take a lot of things for granted with that art form, it is the only way to show you that people see the same thing differently. And the best example I had was, I am lucky enough that some of those people chose to see me. And so in sharing those with you, it is to give you the opportunity to see how in fact they see differently. These two photographs were made a month apart from each other. And actually this photograph, I almost put it in Adrian and I chickened out at the last minute, but it's gonna be in Portland. This photograph was made in response to a photograph that Adrian Chester, who's sitting in the front row, made in 2012. And Sylvia saw that and said, that's a profound photograph, it's not how I see you. And made this in response. And they will be together in Portland in July. All right. I'm gonna leave this up for a moment. I also want to at this point open this up to questions. I am gonna run through the last few slides, but if people have questions or there's specific photographers that you love that I haven't shown yet, you want to know why. Charles?
I just have a question about landscape photography and sort of your relationship to it. Now, if there is a man-made object or something in a landscape, is it no longer landscape photography? And this is in relation to Trevor's or Christian Berry's work.
I think that this is probably the best answer to that question. And it took me a long time to realize that actually what I am most drawn to are humans. And so where landscapes relate to the human condition, I like the barn. I mean, that's one of my, the Christian Berry barn is like all time one of my most favorite photographs. And that's basically landscape. Most of what Christian Berry does is landscape. Most of what Robert Adams does is landscape. It has to unsettle me, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like landscape that I look at and I see is beautiful, I want to just go outside and see it. I want to climb my own apple tree. If it, Keith Carter, I think, said best. It's like there's the photograph you need to see once. There's the photograph you turn to look at the second time. And then there's the photograph that you see and you're like, I have to live with that in some way. Postcard, book, print, whatever. Like, I have to keep seeing it. And I think that the majority of landscape work that I see, I don't have to keep seeing it. And so it's challenging because I respect photographers, particularly in our region, right? There's so much to see. I respect the inclination, and I try so hard. But actually what happens is that it's often too perfect. And because there is the desire for perfection, it almost loses its function as a photograph. Right? And so I'm just gonna go through these because these are the people who are here in our backyard, and I want to see.
That answers my, it's about flipping the script in a sense.
Well, to some extent, but then it's also about the why. Why are you making this picture? Are you making this picture to hold the sunset? Are you making this picture, are you constructing it? Are you holding the light? I mean, the photograph that I is this a landscape photograph? It's a horizon. This is a landscape photograph I live with, let's put it that way. This is a landscape photograph that I respond to.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is because, I'm navigating my own
Absolutely.
way through landscape photography, which is new to me, so, yeah.
I think that landscape as a genre speaks to many of us because, again, it is, how do I start seeing what I see? And I would put next to landscape, when we travel to places we've never been before, and we're seeing everything for the first time, we're seeing everything new, our first inclination is to share that with everybody. And so when I go to portfolio reviews, I can literally clock, is Vietnam the place? Is it Cuba? Is it Puerto Rico now? Everyone's going to Turkey. Like, you can see it. 30% of the photographs that people are showing me are made in a particular place. And 90% of them are uninteresting, outside of that personal experience. They are absolutely interesting to the person who took them. And so I think it's always that tension. And it's valid and relevant if it's interesting to you, absolutely. But the next step of that is, does it resonate with anyone else? Does it speak to anyone else? Does it move anyone else? If this photograph did not have a sign that said Never Neverland, Home of the Lost Boys, I would probably not have responded to it in the same way. And this is the work of Eric Johnson, who works primarily in landscape. This is the work we published. Portraits of trees under very strange colors, for instance.
I walk by every single day.
I put that one in.
29.
I mean, if you're talking about landscape, Paul is a really interesting person to consider, right? When you think about his Warp and Weft series and the ways in which Paul Berger founded the photo program at the University of Washington and taught there for 35 years. I mean, these are photographs of chalkboards. Very basically boring subject matter, but chose to see it in a different way. Also chooses to see the environment in a different way. This photograph, to a lot of you, is probably going to be about a lot of different things. This photograph, to me, the gesture of the hand makes this a photograph that I will return to again and again and again. Jenny Riffle and Molly Landreth grew up north of Seattle. This is a series they made between their last year of high school and their first year of college. They fell in love with each other in photography at the same time. And these photographs are self-portraits, so this is a collage. What they made, they would set up a tripod and then trigger these. Crystal, this one is in your Cousin Puyallup, we drove around in circles. We hung off train trestles. We drove around in circles. We drove to Mount Rainier and then drove back. It was a different time. A simple portrait that's not. Rachel has 2 of these in the book where it really feels like a Renaissance painting. Like, those are gifts. Preston Singletary is not a photographer, but Russell Johnson is. And Preston Singletary is a 3-dimensional artist who was smart enough for the majority of his career to have a single, actually 2 to 3 photographers, but he always has his work well photographed. And because of that, we have a different experience of his work. So, my little shout out to us. Selena Carney, who is collecting and photographing objects. And this piece is also in the back. And I so appreciate your patience go stand with the photographs you didn't get to see, some of which are on the wall back there, please feel free to come and ask questions or share thoughts. And most importantly, please go see Charles Peterson's Nirvana, which is upstairs, and also visit Carrie in the bookstore, where there are books for sale. Thank you.